Hello everybody and welcome. So I'm Emma Griffin, I'm the President of the Royal Historical Society, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome so many of you today to today's training session on creating public history, a guide to co-production and community engagement. Before we begin, I've got a little bit of housekeeping. First, I'd like to remind everybody that the event has subtitles, and you can switch that function either on or off by clicking on the CC/live transcript button, which should be on the bottom right hand of your screen. A reminder too that the event is being recorded, so if you're unable to stay for the duration, or if you want to check in future on anything that you've heard, you'll be able to find the recording through the RHS website, and we will share that with everybody here today in the near future. If you've got any issues at all during the event, just use the chat function and a member of our RHS team will be in touch. Well, as many of you know, the Royal Historical Society is the UK's learned society for the discipline of history. We support historians across many facets of their work, both inside and outside universities. And one part of that work that we take very seriously is supporting postgraduate students and new entrants to the profession. So today's workshop is part of a long-standing tradition of events that we run in order to help people at this particular career stage. We've got more events lined up for next year, and I'll update you about those at the end of today's session. But for today, we've divided the event into two sections. We're going to run up to the first hour with a session about devising and setting up a project, and the second part is going to be about the legacy of projects. I'm going to start by introducing our wonderful speakers today. So firstly, we have Catherine Clark, who is the Director of the Centre for the History of People, Place and Community at the Institute of Historical Research, University of London. So Catherine's got particular expertise in place and placemaking, in the uses of heritage, in creative practice and research, co-production and engagement, and she's led a number of projects such as Discover Medieval Chester, City Witness and the St Thomas Way. Her current public history work includes the project Invisible Worlds, which explores the legend of Alderley Edge in northeast Cheshire, and Towns and the Cultural Economies of Recovery, which is an AHRC funded project to scope future research priorities that enhance the understanding of culture, towns and economic recovery. She's also the Director of the Centre for the History of People, Place and Community. We've also got today Sarah Hughes, who is the Civic Engagement Officer at Cardiff University Libraries and Archives and is the co-founder of the East End Women's Museum. Sarah's got extensive experience of working in museums and heritage as a researcher, curator and broadcaster. Having started a career at the National Museum of Wales, she now works at Cardiff University Special Collections and Archives. She is also the co-founder of East End Women's Museum, the only museum in England which collects and celebrates the history of women and girls. Established as a positive protest, the museum has grown far beyond its original kitchen table origins and has numerous projects taking place across East London and will soon be moving into a physical site in Barking in 2022. She's also currently undertaking a PhD in museums and activism at the University of Swansea. And finally, Amy Todd, she's the Programme Manager at Newington Green Meeting House in North London and a former engagement manager for Layers of London, a digital mapping and public history project based at the Institute of Historical Research. Newington Green Meeting House today is a free heritage space following its recent renovation. Her work at Newington Green centres around engaging audiences traditionally underrepresented in heritage projects. Her previous experience of managing public history projects include the online Layers of London, managing volunteers at Kenley Revival, and a number of co-curation of projects with community groups, schools and artists. Well, let's get started. Our panel are all going to say something about starting up projects. I'll just close by saying, feel free to use the Q&A function as you listen. We prefer you to use that rather than the chat. It's a bit easier for us to keep an eye on it. We're going to pick up and take as many questions as we can during the session today. Brilliant. Catherine, over to you.
Thanks very much, Emma. Hello, everyone. I'm just going to have a go at sharing my slides. Can everyone see my opening slide here? Yeah, brilliant. Well, thanks so much for the invitation to be part of this event. I'm looking forward to learning a lot this afternoon. So I was given a couple of prompts for this opening segment, beginning with the question, how do we define our terms? And I've got to say, we're dealing with some pretty big concepts today, and I can't hope to define them all properly in a few minutes right now. What is public history? I think we could spend all day talking about this, but recently in our IHR MOOC on applied public history, I suggested one very short definition, that public history is history that makes things happen. And I think that vital dynamic connection between history and practice, change and transformation in the real world is hugely important. Today, we're also thinking with terms like engagement and co-production. And of course, there's a rich and complex and also contested vocabulary around various practices of public history. For me, speaking as a researcher, co-production takes us beyond engagement. It takes us to working with communities and involving others in our research and practice. You might also use the language of co-creation or participatory research or maybe citizen research. So what does co-production add to our work? I've suggested some possibilities here, and you'll see that this is all very much about enlarging, enriching and nuancing our research, from our methodologies right through to our outputs. And I wanted to flag right from the start that thinking about co-production must always involve thinking about ethical issues like sharing, respect and labour. And also finally on this slide, a question that I always come back to when I'm thinking about co-production. Is co-production really all about productivity and outputs and production, as the term seems to suggest? I think it can be reductive to think about the value of co-production purely in terms of what gets produced as an end result. The unique value of co-production is often about those new ways of working, new relationships and alignments that you build together. So I'm going to focus on conceptualizing and defining your project with reference to a project that I led recently, and I mentioned it, the St. Thomas Way. Here are some of the lessons that I've learned. First of all, and I'm sure you've heard this before, build in co-production right from the start. It's not something to tack on at the end, but it will fundamentally shape your research questions, methodologies, your aims. What can other experts, professionals, practitioners and communities add to your project? And a way of flipping that question would be to ask, what can't you do without them? Talk to people with different perspectives. They'll bring new imagination and ideas. They will also take you out of your comfort zone. Map your motivations and also those of your partners and communities. You'll need to find shared goals and priorities so that crucially the research is of benefit and value to everyone and you're all invested. Identify, if you can, a champion or core partner who'll help you reach out through their own networks and communities. And finally, but of course this is really the very start, you need to find your way in conceptually. And this, I think, can be a bit different from the usual ways into research. So the St. Thomas Way followed on from a big research project on medieval Swansea, which I led way back in 2013 to 14, City Witness. And the City Witness project itself actually started in an unusual way. I was approached by Swansea City Council, who wanted help with a big regeneration project in the city centre. So that project itself had co-production baked in right from the start, and it developed quite differently from a lot of conventional university-based research. In this project on medieval Swansea, some of you must have heard me talk about it before, we focused on this really fascinating story, the hanging of a Welsh outlaw, William Cragg, in Swansea in 1290, but then Cragg was apparently brought back to life by a miracle of St. Thomas of Hereford. We used our research to recover and interpret the medieval heritage of Swansea. But at the end of the project, we could still see some really big challenges, including the need to put Swansea on the map as a heritage tourism destination, because it's just not somewhere that people think of. And the St. Thomas Way grew out of a very tiny hint right at the edges of the Swansea project and the William Cragg story. And in my experience, you don't always find the beginnings of public history projects in the most obvious places. Look to the edges, the gaps, the tiny sparks. So at the end of the long, detailed medieval documents giving accounts of William Cragg's hanging and revival, there's this very brief note. After his recovery, he went on pilgrimage to the shrine of St. Thomas at Hereford Cathedral. And that really tiny note was the inspiration for the whole of the St. Thomas Way. working with anchor institutions like Hereford Cathedral and Swansea Museum, but also local communities right across the region, we developed a heritage route inspired by this medieval pilgrimage. It linked places together in a narrative, some well-established tourist destinations, others definitely not, and reanimated this lost medieval landscape. And just really briefly, I want to share another example of that unexpected way into co-produced public history. We got additional funding to involve an artist, something that I've always found a really brilliant way of bringing different ideas and approaches to public history. Our research fellow, Chloe Mackenzie, and I approached the artist Michelle Rumley, and we looked at the medieval sources with her. And the detail that she focused in on was totally not what we expected. After William Cragg was hanged in Swansea, the lady of the castle sent her maid to measure him to St. Thomas. Now that apparently meant that a piece of string was cut to the length of his body to be used as the wick of a candle to be sent to the shrine of the saint as a votive offering. And with Michelle, this became the starting point for a huge co-produced art project involving hundreds of people across Wales and England and beyond. Each one of these coils of thread is a self-portrait. It represents a person. And this artwork has now toured places across England and Wales, churches, cathedrals, art galleries, and it continues to grow. So to end this segment, I'm going to come back to that question. What is public history? And I want to think about it from that perspective of conceptualizing and devising a co-produced project. First of all, I really want to emphasize that for those of us who are research active and working in a research environment, co-produced history can certainly be research. It can help you discover new ways of being a historian. And in the case of the St. Thomas Way, all that work with communities, deepening our understanding of place, or with Michelle, thinking about identity and devotional practices, that was research, and it culminated in this book, which was submitted as research to the REF. And probably the main thing that I would emphasize when conceptualizing your project is that it's actually best to put away definitions, put aside categories, and expect the unexpected. So that's where I will leave it for now. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much, Catherine. That's absolutely brilliant. Well, we've got a presentation coming up from Sarah next. But just before we move to the next presentations, I wonder if either Sarah or Amy have comments or questions for Catherine at this point, which she won't necessarily answer, but I'll take a note of them and we'll throw them into the mix.
I just thank you so much for your presentation. It summed up everything I'm too afraid to say out loud about public history, to be too definitive about it. But I just wanted to thank you for bringing up the really, really crucial point that it goes beyond engagement. It is a methodology in and of itself. And very often we use the terms before we fully know what they mean. And so it is really important to be more precise in how we use terminology like public engagement or co-production. And also you bring up a really interesting point that, you know, co-production, it is very, very output focused. And through my career, all of the work that I've done in this field, you know, to be cheesy, it's always been about the journey, not the destination. In the end, it really has been about the friends you make along the way type of thing. And so it's really important to value that and cost it in as well as what your output is going to cost, the time you spend with the public that you've chosen to work with. So thank you for that.
I nearly said, Sarah, I nearly used that phrase, it's about the journey. So I'm glad you did.
Catherine, that was great. I think that, you know, the thing that really resonated with me working with artists and communities and things like that is that you don't know what their needs are going to be, and that will change. And maybe, you know, you make a plan because they have a need at the moment, and then, you know, 2 years down the line when you get into delivering the project, it's a different need, and you need to be open to that because it needs to be a, you know, mutually beneficial partnership. So that will always evolve and be messy and change. So I think that's good to know from the start.
Brilliant. Thank you both very much. Okay, Sarah, I'm going to pass over to you at this point. No, I'm on mute. You're on mute.
Oh, right. That means I have to get the round in, don't I? If I was the person that started talking on mute.
Well, I said to you, we were on mute whilst I was on mute as well. So I think we'll share it. Anyway, over to you.
Thank you. And thanks for the lovely introduction. I will be drawing from my experience here as a museum worker, and then nowadays as someone who works supporting research in a higher education context at Cardiff University Libraries and Archives, and also as co-founder and former co-chair of East End Women's Museum, which I stepped back from last month, but played a founding role and a role in running the project for the last 6 years. And I was given the lovely task of talking about how to get started on a public history programme. And I might be the wrong person to ask, because the East End Women's Museum, which has been so successful, started by mistake. You know, it was a tweet. It seemed like a good idea. It got completely out of hand. And within a week, we had over 800 people asking if they could help, how could they support the project. And I think by about a month, we had the New York Times asking, you know, when were we opening? So in terms of starting something, these things can start in all sorts of different ways. And I could quote you any number of project management, textbooks, and all sorts of things like that. But I'm not going to today. I encourage you to look at those things. So you're planning your projects, you know, to a certain extent by the book, that you're setting aims and objectives, learning outcomes, that you're looking after your budget, and that you're costing in and being realistic about your staff time, about the time you want to spend with your community. But I'm actually just going to give you 3 provocations instead. And the first one's a little bit harsh, I guess. The first one being, who cares? Chances are you and a few academic colleagues and perhaps some enthusiasts are going to be the people who care the most about the topic that you're trying to share. And very often when I work with academics, they will want to share everything that they know, because it's so important and so vital to them to get that message across. So I think in terms of working with the public, you have to acknowledge that this is going to be one of all myriad of things that they're going to be interested by, and things that are going to be demanding their attention. So that first provocation is to think about a really, really simple way of describing your project, a kind of cause for support that you can summarize, not even in an elevator pitch, but a sentence that will drill down to why people should give a hoot about your project. It's a really important thing to have. And the other side of who cares is actually these communities of support. They will be out there already. Have a look at who is already really enthused about the topic, who is out there doing volunteering work about it, what community heritage organizations have already done a project about this and could maybe do with some institutional support or with some collaborative input. So that was my first provocation, is who cares? The second one is don't believe Costner's law. Costner's law, or build it and they will come, is given a lot of credence in public engagement. It is in fact something a ghost said to Kevin Costner in a film in 1989, and not a public engagement or public history strategy. Build it and they will come rarely works. Sometimes I've been presented with academics who said, I've made this amazing website, it's got, you know, all of these wonderful historical documents on it, none of which are searchable, but there's 10,000 of them and I want people to care. Make it happen. And you have to put work into your comms. You have to make sure that your messaging is clear, that your language is clear, and that you're actually engaging with, especially if you're in a university or a heritage organization, that you're working with your partners in comms as soon as possible, so that they're aware of your key messages and that they can give you that support all along the way, and maintain that momentum. Once sometimes the funding is gone, there'll still be reasons to sell that, there'll still be reasons to amplify that project. So don't be taken in by Kevin Costner or the ghost that spoke to Kevin Costner. Make sure that you do the marketing work, that you do the publication work, and that you get out there into village halls, wherever your public might be, to make sure that they know what your project's about and engage with it. Costner's law, after Kevin Costner, for the chat there. And the third provocation I wanted to give you was to make mindful invitations. So today, you know, it's a necessary, incomplete panel, I guess, because we're all white women. We're not going to be giving a full picture of public history from all perspectives. And I think that's true for most public history projects. They are necessarily incomplete because they focus on individual experience and you've got finite resources. But I do want to encourage you to be mindful in the invitations you make. If you're putting on project after project and you're seeing the same group of stalwarts or the same group of regulars turning up to everything, that's wonderful. But if they are the same skin color as you, they're people who you're friends with, they're sort of people who are retired staff, things like that, I would encourage you to be more mindful in the invitations you make, how you word them, where you place them. And the trick that I found that really helps me with this exercise is to ask myself 3 questions. The first is, who can take part in this activity? And the answer will normally be, oh, everyone. We want everyone to take part. And the second question then will be, well, who is able to? And once you look at perhaps the event that you're putting on, it'll be, well, it has to be someone who can drive, who has access to a car. It has to be somebody who has evenings free, so possibly somebody without childcare responsibilities. And, you know, the topic I'm presenting, it's quite niche, maybe. Well, it'll be people perhaps who have already gained some level of expertise in a historical topic or have studied it in school. So that question of who can take part, well, who is able to take part? And the third question is to look at who is actually taking part. Who is showing up? Who is in the room with you when you're putting these things on? And you'll find that there's a big difference between the answers to those 3 questions. And that, for me, as public historians, is where our work really is where we go from having that, yes, everyone should be able to engage with this, to who is actually in the room and how we fill in those gaps and be more mindful about them. So yeah, those are my 3 provocations for you. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Sarah. So Catherine and Amy, do you want to make a comment about what you've heard before we move on?
Oh, I thought it was brilliant, Sarah. Thank you so much. And I that really resonated for me. You talking about the East End Women's Museum, you said started by mistake. I love that. That was just what I was sort of hinting at in terms of thinking about the edges or that serendipity or luck or accident that often leads to a public history project. And there are things we can do to kind of make that sort of luck more likely to happen, I think. But I think that's really, really interesting. I think there's also perhaps you know, we could open a conversation about what you're saying about the sort of the role of, I suppose it's sort of enterprise or kind of slightly entrepreneurial kind of spirit, isn't it, to kind of communicating and reaching out and sharing, and something that I'm so grateful to you for raising, because I think it's so important, are those issues around inclusion and exclusion and participation. And I'd love it if that's something that we come back to in questions and discussion later. It's so crucial. Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's easy to fall into traps, isn't it? When you see other, and sometimes this is great work, but you know, you get used to the kind of output that people expect of a heritage site, of a project, whether that's the people delivering it or, you know, what audiences, you know, assume of these kind of places. And there's so much more that you can do and should do and question, but sometimes we just fall into those traps. And oftentimes it's also just because, you know, I don't know, you're busy, you're up against it with the funders or whatever, and you're used to working in that way, so you do it. And sometimes it really does take other people to kind of come in and go, well, why don't you do this? And then you think, oh yeah, we could do that, you know. So yeah, I think that's a really valuable point.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And thanks for the comments as well. So Amy, we're going to finish this part of the session with you, aren't we? So I'll hand back over to you.
Yes, yes. So I'm going to just talk for a minute on how do we run a successful project after initial setup and design. So I manage the project at Newington Green Meeting House, and this is kind of where I usually come in this kind of work. So I've never actually been involved in the initial design and setup. I'm usually like the staff member that comes in and is hired to run it afterwards. But obviously a lot changes as you go, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So I think the team are a really crucial part of this kind of work. And when I say team, that is scaled up and down according to where you work. So that might involve trustees and volunteers, paid staff. You know, for example, the meeting house is still an active place of worship, so we have a congregation. All of these people are part of that team that deliver what we deliver here on our heritage project. And that's really important. And they each have kind of different roles and responsibilities. And some of those roles and responsibilities are part of the wider organisation. So obviously, as a project, we are a project that works within a wider permanent organisation. And that has pros and cons. You know, there's always friction, and you're working at different timescales to different deadlines. You have different priorities. Project working is very different to working in like a permanent institution. So they can rub up against each other, and it's really good to have buy-in from the wider organisation to make that work. And I think it's also important when you're delivering projects like that is to kind of have someone who can kind of overlook everything. And that person needs to be flexible. That person is usually kind of like, here, it's me. It's someone who, especially in the first year or two, does a little bit of everything. You're setting up for events, you're overseeing the social media, you're helping with the interpretation, but you've kind of, you know, you're picking up on all the slack and, you know, things like that. You kind of need someone who will kind of oversee it. And I've put this at the bottom because I think this is really important, is that when a new project starts, there is historic, you know, politics or different ways of working or people that have been involved in different things or, you know, people that were particularly keen on this. And it's really important for the person who has to do all this work to know all of that stuff from the start, so that you have those tools. If there's someone who's not keen on it, or if there's someone who, I don't know, was interested in being involved and then didn't end up getting involved, know all of that stuff from the start so that you feel comfortable and you've got those problems, rather than finding them out a year later and then someone saying, oh yeah, they were never keen on that project. And you think, oh, why didn't I know that? I could have maybe won them over. So knowing all the information from the start, I think that kind of handover when you're delivering something is super important. And we've talked a lot about flexibility, but this was one of the points I wanted to raise when you're running the project too, is that, you know, what happens is in my experience, I am hired to deliver projects that have already been designed and set up, and there's an incredible amount of work that have gone into them. But obviously everyone knows things will evolve and change. And just like when you work, you know, with community groups, you're trying to meet community need for your project, that will change. And at the meeting house, that changed because we had a pandemic also. So, you know, we were meant to deliver on-site things and we couldn't. So we had to think about what we could do online, and we were flexible, delivering things online, using the staff skills and interests, and, you know, what's everyone interested in? What have you got skills to deliver? We came up with some, you know, really amazing ways of working. So Stephen, who's our events coordinator, is quite involved in art stuff and the art scene, introduced us to Girls Zine Fair, and we ran these online zine making workshops, which got a great crowd that would probably have not engaged with the meeting house just for a visit, you know, in a physical space. And led to things like this community publishing project, Enzine, where we publish twice a year community writing. And this is all based from our kind of radical histories and stories, but just in a much more flexible way. So it leads to really nice ways of working. And this is something that Sarah mentioned also about representation. So, for example, you know, running these kind of projects, working with these kind of groups have different needs, and then, you know, as soon as you work with one group, they might be like, oh, there's this other group, you know, you should know about these, you should work with them. So these are some of the comments that we've had from working in this way, I suppose, by meeting community need first and then finding a way that that's mutually beneficial. So Xenia, this group here, they get a free space here every Saturday, and they use the building. Because of that, they feel comfortable in this building. Because of that, they know who I am. And then because of that, they know who Mary Wollstonecraft is. And now we're working on a project where these women write about their lives as refugees and migrants. That's how you build trust, and it takes a long time. And so I think that would be my key message there. this is a bit of the same, I suppose, but staying open to new possibilities, new ways of working, as we were saying earlier. You know, someone might suggest an exhibition that you've never thought about. You have no idea how to do it, how the resources, you don't have a budget line for it, but, you know, have those conversations and see what happens. And it will take a while for you, I think, also to understand what the parameters of your project are. So don't say no because our plan isn't to do that, because our plan says this, this, and this. You know, deliver those things and review them and, you know, see if they're working for you, and, you know, take a note of your audiences. Are you engaging who you're engaging? And if you're not, question why, and question if you should carry on doing this kind of thing anymore, and maybe, you know, try out, experiment with something else. So I think I'll leave it there.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Amy. So fascinating. So, Catherine, we've got a few moments. I'm going to encourage everybody to start using the Q&A feature, and we'll be able to feed questions that you've got. You can put in questions or comments or observations in there. But we'll do what we've done so far and invite Catherine and Sarah to comment on what they've heard from Amy in the first instance.
You go first.
No, you go, Sarah. You're quicker on the draw.
There was so much useful advice and insight in that, Amy. Thank you so much for sharing it. And I really liked your kind of use the word parachuting, the idea, you know, that when the funding stops, the kind of academic interest in the community stops. And there are, as you said, unexpected ways to make sure that you are creating output, like with the N-zine and things like that, where you are creating things that have a life beyond the project. And I think it was absolutely fundamental that you mentioned the institutional memory of a project if you do inherit one. My first ever job in heritage was at St Fagan's History Museum, and part of it was dressing up as a Tudor, and we'll say no more about that. But the other half was working with a community whose church had been moved to the museum, and it was a project that had taken 10 years. And they were getting, you know, slightly annoyed that the church hadn't been built yet, but it was a medieval building. It required a lot of care. And my job was to drive to Pontarddulais and convince these people that no, we hadn't stolen their church, and yes, it would be open very soon. And it was invaluable to have the local vicar to speak to, because he could tell me who did what, who was out down at the graveyard maintaining the walls, who was doing what, who had fallen out with whom. And I think as well, it ties to this idea of a personality-led public history project, where you do have very charismatic people who'll turn up and get everyone enthused. And I've seen some fantastic facilitators who perhaps don't do as much of the ground, but show up and dazzle everybody. And then when they leave, the enthusiasm leaves as well. So it really is about getting to know people and building that trust over time, because that parachuting in can be quite detrimental, I think, sometimes, or at least it can be very disrespectful to the people you're hoping to work with.
Yeah, I totally agree with that as well, Sarah, and the risks around that kind of charismatic leadership and the way that kind of also raises challenges around inclusion, exclusion as well. And yeah, I was really struck. It was brilliant, Amy, and I loved what you were saying about building trust. And I can already see, I'd like to comment on that, and I can see it engages with one of the questions that's been asked in the Q&A by Mike. So I'll hold back from that maybe, because we'll come back to that. I really like the way you talked about different team roles, and I'm really conscious that we've got a range of people at different career stages here today, but a lot of ECRs as well. And I suppose what was really helpful, the way you outlined that, is that it's about identifying the roles in a project, isn't it? So even if you're an ECR and you're kind of a one-man band or one-woman band, or you're working with, you know, just one other person, once you've identified the roles, then you know what you're covering, and also you can scale it up and down according to sort of what happens in the lifetime of your project. So that was really helpful, and I love that you addressed the challenges and the opportunities of moving this kind of co-production online. And I bet we're going to talk more about that. I'm sure there'll be questions about that. So I want to get stuck into the Q&A, Emma.
Great. Yes, I do as well. Lots of questions are coming in. We may not be able to get through all of them. I'm going to do my best to navigate a pathway through all of them. I thought I'd start with this one, which kind of takes us to the beginning in some respects for these projects. It'd be great to hear. This is John Winder. It would be great to hear a bit more about where the funding for projects come from, particularly in relation to ECR funding opportunities. So for many people, that's going to be the first thing they need to deal with, is to get hold of some money. So I just wonder if people panel have got tips or thoughts on that kind of foundational part of a project.
I suppose the first thing that I would say is often you don't need a huge amount of money. There are some things, you know, that there are different scales of these co-production projects, but for some things you only need a small grant, and there are all kinds of places you can go to for those small grants. If you've got any kind of institutional affiliation or honorary institutional affiliation, universities are very keen to support work that is engaged and connecting with communities, and there are lots of pots of money. There are kind of national projects you can go to, like the Being Human Festival, or lots of the funders that offer, you know, quite small grants you can go to, and it can be quite responsive and agile right the way through to you know, maybe you've got a more secure position and you can apply to a research council or National Lottery Heritage Fund. But I think it's important that the three of us presenting today don't give the impression that you need big bucks to get one of these projects off the ground. With the big bucks comes always the problem as well of the cliff edge that Amy and Sarah have already identified when the funding stops. And actually that can be challenges of its own. But if you've got something that is kind of lower sort of scale in terms of funding, that can be more sustainable. I don't know what you think, Amy and Sarah.
I mean, I wouldn't take my advice, which is start a museum by mistake and use your credit card for a bit. Yeah, but it cost very little money to get, you know, printables done, and you know, if you've got mostly a good vinyl printer or somebody who can knock you out of exhibition panels on the cheap, your first year is covered, you're fine. No. Of being facetious, I guess I did want to just chime in a little bit about crowdfunding, because this has been an option that we've used at East End Women's Museum. It can be really, really successful, especially if it's kind of limited time, limited number of rewards, and it's kind of almost made into a competition of, you know, who's going to help us round up, who can help us, you know, reach our target. But it is really resource heavy on people. So if you are going to choose something like a crowdfunded project, it's to make sure that you've pre-primed some donors already to get the momentum going, and also just be wary that it takes a lot of your time, and it could be time that you could be using writing a grant or whatever as well.
Brilliant, thank you. Amy, shall I just move on to the, we've got lots of questions coming in, so I'll move on to another one. I rather like this one from Mike Ebster. He says, all very helpful, thank you. Tips on timescales. So reconciling the institutional pressure to deliver something quickly versus the longer term nature of setting up a true co-production and collaboration. And I think that's a lovely question as well, that goes to the heart of getting the money is great, then you to some degree need to dance to the funders' tune. And I wonder if you could just say something about squaring that particular circle.
I think it's, I kind of take it on as my role to sometimes educate the funders. That sounds awful, but like, you know, I think that yeah, there's a lot of pressure on you to deliver things, and you know, sometimes those things can feel quite tick boxy, and you know, I've always had very good relationships with funders and great opportunities. They've always been very flexible, so I've always liked that, and it's always been more of a conversation and a discussion rather than no, we need this and this. So I've not had bad experiences, but I think that there is a pressure, and ultimately, if you want to make those relationships with groups that are underserved in the sector, it comes from building relationships and building trust, just like any human relationships do, and it just takes time. And so, if you want to do it in a genuine way, I think you have to just keep pushing that. And you know, it's something that we've had at the Meeting House. So, for example, you know, we have a big Turkish community locally. There's, you know, lots of working class populations that live locally that don't really engage, you know, and people have said, well, you know, well, how do we do that? Maybe we should put a programme on for that community. And and sometimes that does work, you know, but I have advocated for like giving that free space, like with the Xenia group. We do that with some, you know, older social groups locally and things like that. With the Turkish parents group, give them a free space so that they can do what they want in your building, and then, you know, then build the relationship up from there. Another thing in that period in the pandemic, you know, going to a community group, it was a bit like someone else mentioned it earlier, you know, people are already doing that work. So you can just go to them and say, well, I love what you're doing there. What can we do to help? Do you want some space? Do you want to use our staff resource? Do you want to use our platforms? You know, do you, you know, financially, is there something that we can deliver? You know, there's lots of things that other people can do that you can't do yourself. And that seems to work. And a lot of the time they'll already have those audiences that you're looking to get anyway. So.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I've got a kind of sort of a few different reflections, but not a kind of obvious solution to those challenges. And can I say that I think that question does also intersect with Clarinda's question in the chat about being sustainable after public funding has run out, because this, again, it's to do with the short-term nature of funding and the need for kind of short-term outcomes, as opposed to, you know, everything you've been showing, Amy, about the long-term process of building trust and true co-production relationships. So first of all, yeah, I think that is very real, the demand for kind of short-term you know, outputs and outcomes. One of the ways of dealing with that is to think about phases for a project and talk in terms of phases right from the start and build in kind of concrete outcomes at different stages. So again, there might be a scale there might be quite modest outcomes to start with, but you can point to something that's a concrete outcome right from the start, even if it's an event rather than the big resource you're hoping to work towards together, say. One of the challenges there, though, of course, is that if you're going back for funding for multiple phases, no funder will ever want to fund more of the same. They will always want to see that they're funding something new. So you have to get very good at articulating how it's new and it's not just continuation. That's always a real challenge. Then you have the challenge of the kind of cliff edge when each bit of funding, if you've been lucky enough to get funding, comes to an end. With sort of loss of posts, loss of that capacity, and crucially loss of funded time if you've been able to get some of your time allocated to a project. I do think universities are getting better at understanding that it's a long game. I think whatever the imperfections around the impact agenda, which I will talk about later, I think universities are understanding that the value of projects often only emerges in the longer term and that they need to give people space and time. They're better at understanding that, not perfect, but it's getting better. And I'd really echo what Amy says about how the help of an external partner can be really crucial here. So for one example here, with the St Thomas Way, we had funding for a fixed amount of time, and we've got funding to maintain our own website for a fixed amount of time. We don't have any staff on the project anymore, but we've teamed up with the British Pilgrimage Trust, and they've put all our resources onto their website. So it's greater sustainability for the project, which we couldn't resource financially ourselves. They are helping us kind of share the message as well. So absolutely would endorse what Amy says about that. I hope something in there was useful.
I'm just following on from that point, I think having worked in digital media in National Museum Wales for a long time, I've become used to project websites falling off the internet. So if I could just say, when you are putting in your applications, not only be creative with how you're designing things. So if your funder wants a particular kind of output, you can front load that. You can have your event at the start of the project and use it to gather data and to do something exciting rather than go for this kind of almost like reality TV. You know, when they make over the hotel, there's an event at the end and they all get to see the hotel and they go, "Ooh, the hotel is lovely." You don't have to do that. You can put the event at the beginning if you want. You can put it in the middle to test your theory or something like that. And you know, if you've got boxes to tick, you can do it that way. But with the digital output, at Cardiff University Special Collections and Archives, we've been working with JSTOR Community Collections, with archive.org. We've been really as proactive as we can be, not only in making sure that outputs are available on open license, so they are not proprietary. They can go on the open web. They're not in some siloed app somewhere that will again fall off the App Store or will require, you know, when the next iOS update comes, it disappears. And I know it's really boring when I look at funding applications that have a digital component, the attention paid to things like interoperable metadata, and I know I said it, is scant. And tokenistic very often, but it's that level of digital design that can really make sure that your project lives on, because your digital assets will be discoverable. They can be picked up by other institutions, they can be picked up by any web user who wants to to make use of them because they're freely available and also they're discoverable on a really core machine-based level. So I would say always get some advice as well from somebody with that kind of IT background, with that information science background. Speak to your academic librarian, just because it can extend the life of your project for a very long time if you've been mindful in how you put your data out there as well. Thank you for letting me read about metadata.
Yeah, somebody had to do it, Sarah. Thank you. I'm going to move on to another question that's come up through the question and answers. Again, it's been covered partly, but I think it's a really interesting question. It's worth a bit more time. And Amy particularly said something very interesting about this a moment ago. But Joanne Mackay says, in our region, it seems there's a core of the engaged, in quotes, with history, etc., who come to most things, and a large number of residents who are not. Have you strategies for moving outside of the bubble of the already engaged to get new communities involved? She says, I appreciate some of this has already been covered. It has, but it's a very big question, and I think it's worth dwelling on a moment longer.
Yeah, I guess I would, like, my kind of strategy here at the Meeting House, which has been really successful, is like, don't go in with your heritage history hat on. Go in with a, you know, we're local, we've got resources, you know, we've got a space on, we've got, you know, we have the skills within our team to do these kind of things. What are you working on? Go to their events, so you're not expecting them to come to you. So engage with what they're doing, show your face, build relationships. These things are hard because it means your evenings and your weekends and things like that. You know, that's the problem with public facing stuff, is it's all encompassing, but that is what it takes. It's building relationships that way. That's what I think I would do, is you know, get yourself out there and do those kind of engage with what they're doing, and then kind of build a relationship, not based on the kind of things that you want to deliver, but based on what their needs are, and then you can create something that is mutually beneficial. But I think it needs to start from a place of them and not your institution.
I love what you're saying, Amy, about using different language. So for us, you know, we're talking about kind of, you know, history or heritage or research, but I love what you're saying, Amy, that's not necessarily the kind of opening language you'll use with other communities. And we really found that in the St. Thomas Way. I mean, talking about kind of nature, or, you know, walking, or let me show you something. So one of the things that we did in the St. Thomas Way, I love an opportunity to show this, we partnered with a microbrewery and we brewed our own beer, which was fun. But these beers were for sale in pubs and cafes along the route, and had information about the project on a really good way of reaching out to people in a totally different context. We've got totally different kind of engagement and participation. I've also learned from some other brilliant projects that we've had relationships with in the Centre for the History of People, Place and Community. I've learned a lot about meeting people where they are. So a project that I think does that absolutely brilliantly is the Museum of Youth Culture, and they have scanning socials where they take scanners to copy people's photos and memorabilia from their own youth. They go to shopping centres and community centres, and I've taken inspiration from that, taking research to new places, whether it's going into a school or going into a particular area or working with particular groups, that you're going to go to them rather than just, it comes back to the builder and they will come, doesn't it, Sarah, rather than expecting them to come to you. So yeah, those are just a few thoughts from me.
Yeah, this was absolutely one of the core kind of activities of East End Women's Museum from the beginning, was because we didn't have a building, we could think of creative ways in which we could be out there. So recording history one week at Watney Market, and then, you know, so we had some ECRs helpfully transcribe and then have a go at interpreting that data in a way that was publicly focused, you know, full presentation to the public. And we just bought a market pitch, I think every week then for a couple of weeks, where we just presented people's testimony back to them, but as an exhibition, for them to see themselves as part of, woven into the fabric of that market. We did talks in squats, we attended protests, we even had a museum, or have a museum banner that we used at I think it was the 80th anniversary of Cable Street. We marched, we were invited to be a kind of women's history block too. I wasn't able to attend, I was in Cardiff, But just that banner that I made, when it was carried through the protest, we found that women came and joined and started talking about their stories of activism, their stories of protest, just as us being there, really. And I think that it goes back to who cares, you know, if you're finding that you have a really disengaged public locally, figure out, you know, what they do care about, figure out why, you know, think about, well, why would they care about this? What else have they got going on in their lives? What kinds of social needs could we maybe be addressing, or what could what relevancy could we have to their lives? And it boils down again to getting that case for support for that audience really figured out, really, really simple. So if it's your scrolling user or somebody walking by wherever you're working on some day, that you've got a way to really impress them with what the project is doing and why they should give a hoot.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, so we're going to be reaching the hour before we know it. A number of questions have come in that focus on legacy, and we've got the whole second half of the session thinking particularly about legacy and sustainability. So I'm just going to move on to one of the other ones that I thought might be worth attending to here. And this is great. Sorry, I can't see the full name. Melanie. Anyway, I'll look up in a moment. But anyway, she says, I work with vulnerable and marginalised communities and individuals. Do you have advice for safeguarding and protecting groups and individuals whilst involving them in stakeholder projects? And I just think that's an important thing that we should touch on before closing this part of the session.
Can I just say really briefly that it's a really important question, and I think all of us have flagged from the start the ethical issues around co-production, that the work we do must never be about commodifying people and their stories, or kind of instrumentalizing people and their stories. That it's a huge privilege if people approach us and want to participate in what we do, and we have to be really careful about that. I think it's a really big question to answer right now, but what I will say is, for example, a project that I'm involved in at the moment on Alderley Edge in Cheshire, we're collecting a lot of surprisingly very personal stories to do with people's memories of place. When people are speaking about themselves, whatever your core focus, even if it's environment and history, it can elicit very vulnerable personal responses. And right from the start of the project, from the very planning and conception, we've worked really closely with ethics advisors in our universities. And I know that should I say this in this format? Sometimes ploughing your way through an ethics checklist can feel a bit soul destroying, but actually it's incredibly helpful and it's crucial. And those are the experts who will help you identify what are the risk areas and make sure that you're protecting and safeguarding people. So I would say if there's someone expert that you can go to for advice, that is really crucial, and it's been vital for us.
I guess within my work, there's usually a kind of a leader within that community group that I will then create the relationship with, and then they will, and that kind of co-production will kind of come from them. So, for example, with the Xenia group, it's kind of non-hierarchical, but there is definitely, like, you know, a couple of people that kind of lead on that work, and then, you know, I will talk to them and they will talk to me about ideas, and they will then talk to the group and then come back to me. So I think maybe trying to find that kind of person who's kind of taking on that role, maybe if they just take on that role at that time, to discuss that with them, I think is really helpful, and that's what I've done in my experience.
Yeah, I support the comments have already been, but just to say, I think you're already working with vulnerable people, and so you will have probably got your bases covered in terms of training, but I'd highly recommend the NSPCC's safeguarding training as a starting point if it's something that you haven't engaged with before. I have come across sort of public history programs before where people are working with slightly older children, for example, but think, oh, well, I was told once, oh, they're over the age of consent, so I don't need to do that training. So there are still some attitudes where people will just assume, oh, because they're over 18 or whatever, you don't need to do the training. So the NSPCC training is definitely what I'd recommend if you are just looking to improve your own skills base in this area.
Great, thank you ever so much to everybody. So that question came from Melanie Horsted, by the way. Sorry, I couldn't see your name on Zoom, it wasn't showing for some reason. So we're going to, I'd love to thank the panel, obviously, first of all, for everything they've done so far and everything they said so far. It's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you to the audience. We're going to take a 5-minute break, which will take us to 1 minute past the hour. And then in our second half, we're going to be looking at evaluation, sustaining and ensuring a legacy for public history projects. So see you all again in 5 minutes. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for that. We're going to get started again for the second half of our session. So we're going to have our panelists speak again in turn, though we're starting in a slightly different order this time. Sarah's going to start. And we're focusing in this half on running a project and particularly on ensuring a legacy, evaluating the work that you're doing. Sarah, I'll shut up and I'll pass over to you.
Thanks, Emma. I was given the lovely task of just outlining some of the benefits of public history, why choose it as a methodology. We've already said, you know, it takes time. You have to work with the community. It's not always easy. So I thought I would outline just a few of those benefits. I was involved in a project called Let's Get Real, run by Culture 24, which is an action research project that rolls on year and has a new sort of topic to look into every year. And they brought in speakers from the Institute of Strategic Dialogue. And they are a kind of civic society organization who work on de-radicalizing people from all kind of walks of extremism. They don't work with Prevent, they work outside that sort of scheme because they think, you know, citizens have a duty to prevent the conditions that would lead to extremism. And one of the things that they said, that when they work with people who have been unfortunately radicalized, is that their story becomes simpler and simpler. You know, white supremacists will say, well, white people are, you know, this is our country, or you know, gay people equals bad, or whatever. They said that the most effective way of challenging those more simple and damaging stories was to complicate it, was to present people over and over again with complication that would eventually render that simple viewpoint untenable. That's always stayed with me, this idea of being able to complicate the story. And I think that's one role that public history can play. You know, put aside all the stuff about extremism, in general civic society, is that it can present us with stories and experiences that are way outside our own, but that give us a pathway into building empathy, to respond creatively, to listen. And I think that is one of the ways that I think public history has a real benefit. To give you an example, at East End Women's Museum, the first physical object we acquired was a teddy bear from the Elon factory. And this was a factory that was run by the East London Federation of Suffragettes. Quite nicely and seasonally, the Elfs had their toy factory. But this is one of the practical ways that they addressed what they saw as a myriad of problems that women faced. It wasn't just about the vote. It was about childcare. It was about equal pay or fair pay. And so this was a factory where women working there were fairly paid to create the toys. And, you know, when you sort of start talking about voter enfranchisement and things like that, people, you know, you're not going to catch everybody, but hopefully everybody has a memory of a teddy bear. Everyone can relate to that little bear. And so for us, that object that was quite creative gave us a way in to a more complicated story. And that's one way that public history, I think, can be really effective. And I know we've got a person from a meeting house here, but public historians can work as connectors. We can create meeting places for people who might not otherwise meet. The great and the good, they love an exhibition opening, they love a little nibbles, free drinks pre-COVID, or an invitation to somewhere that they can show out. And these aren't people normally that perhaps will cross paths with what, you know, you might call service users or members of the public or people who are marginalized in some way. I know that at several of our openings at East End Women's Museum, we've had protests. We had someone call for a general strike once. We've had people show up and demonstrate because they knew they'd been asking for a meeting with the mayor for months and months. They didn't get one. And so I know in the exhibition we put on the Women's Hall in Tower Hamlets, which had, thanks to the staff at Tower Hamlets Archive, it had a food bank box. It had a pay what you can kind of food waste cafe in there as well. But at the opening, a group of local mothers who are really concerned about cuts to childcare, we kind of invited them because they participated in the exhibition, and the head of the council, I think, was there, or some of the people that they've been really trying to speak to. And so it's events like these that actually you get a really nice cross-section of people where your funders, your stakeholders actually get to meet the people that you work with, to meet that public. And it's a really powerful thing that you can enable and you can actually facilitate deliberately to again address social need, for example. And I think the last thing that I would bring up as a real benefit, that in my experience anyway, is that it is a form of knowledge generation. I think we had a link to Emergent Strategy earlier in the chat from Amy. Fantastic book. If you can get your hands on a copy of it, I would encourage you to read it. But that we are generally, especially in higher education, our general model of public engagement is based on a Victorian philanthropic way of working, where we kind of come and bestow, you know, the gifts of our institution and our knowledge and experience upon whatever unsuspecting group we've decided to do it to, regardless of whether they've asked if they want it and whether they need it. And I think public history gives you a way through that very extractive way of doing research, where, you know, yeah, you come and observe and then you go away and you author your thing and off you go. It's a process, as we mentioned right at the beginning, and through that there are ways to create knowledge together with the public that you're working with the subject area that you're looking at. And I think it's sometimes knowledge that's generated that could not be reached at in any other way. And I would say, you know, there are conventions for authorship, but they don't always have to be that way. There are ways to share your platform, especially as an academic, in the way you include participants in academic conferences, in the way that you extend that invitation a little further, again, a little more mindfully, to people who will be taking part. And so those are the three things that I would summarize as the kind of, for me anyway, the main benefits, and why I keep coming back to public history, is it complicates the story. It creates meeting places for people whose paths might not otherwise cross. And it is generally a much more generative, less extractive way of creating knowledge together.
Fantastic, thanks. We're going to do the same thing again and invite Amy and Catherine to comment or pose a question or a challenge to Sarah before we move on to our next presentation, which is going to be
a challenge. Go on.
I don't have any challenges or any useful questions. I was just scribbling really fast, Sarah, because I just love the way that you articulated all that. I've written down complicating the story, because I just absolutely love that in terms of what we can do. And there's not an obvious kind of metric for that, is there? But it's so much more. It kind of exceeds any kind of limiting metric. I love what you're saying about what we can do in terms of bringing people together, being connectors or brokers or being a hub, the intersection between public history and social activism. I also really like the language you used about moving away from a kind of extractive model of public history. Earlier in my career, I held what in those days was called an AHRC Knowledge Transfer Fellowship, which was, you know, absolutely that kind of language of just downloading some knowledge to some unsuspecting people. And actually that's not the way we worked at all. And I think already that kind of language was collapsing. You know, it was dissolving because people weren't working like that at that point. But, you know, that was a very formative moment for me in my career, understanding that what I was doing was not that, and it would be so much less valuable if it was that. And I also really like what you're saying about how these different, more capacious kinds of knowledge, they might enlarge our understanding of what constitutes authorship, or what even constitutes the kind of outputs we make, even though we've already said it's not necessarily all about the outputs. And I think I'm going to be honest, I'm not going to brush this under the carpet. That can be a challenge, particularly when you're an ECR, that the kind of output that might come out of your project that might be such a transformational, important output in terms of both research and the real world might not be a monograph, and it might not be an article. And I know that that is really difficult, because there's still a disconnect between universities sometimes talking the talk about the importance of this, but then what you need to convince the hiring committee that you should get that lectureship, or you know, later on looking at promotion, that remains a challenge. But I think universities are getting better at recognising that research can come in different shapes and forms and different kinds of output. And to me, Sarah, that's partly why I'm in it. It's why I'm doing public history and co-production, because I love the idea of doing things that aren't articles and monographs, but I realise I'm in a privileged position, particularly at this point in my career, where I can be more flexible about that.
I think that's same with funders, Catherine, as well. You know, that there's limits to that, and I think one of the things that I struggle with is, yeah, we do these events, like, for example, recently we had a whole programme exploring kind of what it means to be working class in our area today, and one of the ways actually kind of addresses a little bit one of the questions that we asked earlier about how do you get these different audiences. It was the same topic and question we were asking, but we just did it in a variety of ways. A film night, because the people that come to a film night are not going to go to an exhibition, but the people that come to the exhibition are not going to go to a talk. So if you do the same thing, but, you know, in 6 or 7 different mediums, perhaps you're going to get those different people in. And yeah, just sometimes you just know that you've cracked it, but then it's really hard to like write that down in a way that it communicates, you know. So little kind of quotes like I showed earlier are kind of nice. One thing that I try and do is write case studies, and the funders have always really liked that. So it's a kind of narrative of like, so we did this exhibition, which was photographies exploring identity, and the photographer took some pictures of people in the local area. Then that person came into the building to see their photograph, and then from then on has consistently come to events afterwards because we've now built a relationship. That's a good way to develop that, and I think try and move away from that, because it can be, yeah, it can be really hard to kind of write down and prove kind of what your successes are. I think that's very difficult.
Yeah, I think it's really, really useful to think of that, what we used to call in digital media reversioning. Whereas, you know, you might end up with exhibition panels, or they can live on as Instagram captions, or they can be captions for a video, or yeah, your visitor book quotes can be a way of, you know, if you've put your IRL exhibition online, you can use those to kind of impress people and reach a new audience that way. When it comes to going back to what Catherine was mentioning about the extractive nature of research and authorship, and I realise it's a hot potato. As someone who works in an academic library, I'm aware of, you know, the kind of vice grip that the academic publishing model has on lots of different ways in which we work. But I just wanted to point to Freedom Dreams by Robin D.G. Kelly, who is an author and historian of mostly African-American activist and protest movements, especially ones that have failed. And he looks at what we should keep, what we should celebrate, and, and what, even though movements sometimes become problematic, or they fizzle out, or interpersonal problems come in, and these things are very fleeting sometimes. He has a catalogue of those, but the introduction to that book speaks in a very nuanced way to the kind of abolitionist model that says, you should steal all the knowledge from the university and give it to people for free, and the other way, which is, you should extract knowledge from people and bring it into the academy. And he kind of disagrees with all those different ways and says, well, actually, there is a more generative model that doesn't involve sort of dropping science, as he calls it, on people. And there is this way of kind of meeting in the middle and making something new. And I find that a really appealing and encouraging way of working.
Lovely to hear you all speaking to each other's talks. It's really, really fascinating. Catherine, I'm going to move on to you now. You're going to lead the next bit, aren't you?
Okay, thank you. And Sarah, I don't know that book. I'm definitely going to look that up. Thank you so much for the reference. Oh, we've gone right back to the start. Don't worry, not going to go through it all again. Right, here we are. Is that okay? Can everyone see that? So I've been given the job of talking a little bit about how we capture the benefits of history within the framework of impact and beyond. So yes, I am going to be the person, I'm afraid, who mentions the ref, the research excellence framework and talks a bit about that. Now, that is going to come with quite a few health warnings and cautions, starting with this reminder with the help of Bruegel, that it's very easy to miss the most important impact when we're looking elsewhere, when we're using a rigid set of measures and evaluation process. So I love this picture actually as a tool to think with when we're thinking about that. So first of all, a couple of visualizations for explaining what impact is and how we get there. These are absolutely not perfect. You'll see that they're built on a model of research which privileges, academic work leading to public engagement rather than what we're talking about, an ecosystem of research and co-production. But they are a helpful start, I think. Here's another that I really like. And what I like about this is that it reminds us we can deliberately do lots of interesting stuff. And for me, that's very much how I would describe co-produced and participatory research. But there's no guarantee of real impact. There's always a bit of luck and serendipity involved. I think that's something we've all hinted at actually in our talks. So here is quite a dense slide, I'm afraid, giving an overview of the kind of things that might constitute impact within that academic impact framework and what kinds of evidence you might use to prove it. This might also apply, as Amy has suggested, if you are making a case to certain funders too. So the list of different kinds of impact is obviously not exhaustive at all, but the key question is always what changed? It's kind of like your so what question. What changed as a result? And of course, in co-produced research, it's not just your outputs that might create that change, but as we've all said, the practices, relationships and alignments you've developed in the course of your work together. That can be harder to articulate, but can be even more important. I've also given in blue 3 other ways of thinking about kinds of impact, which I personally find useful and a bit more capacious and fluid than a load of checkbox lists. So conceptual impact, better understanding of issues, instrumental impact, influencing the development of solutions, and capacity building, leading to new institutional or individual capabilities. And I think often co-production plays a really big part there. On the other side, I've given a list, again, not comprehensive at all, of different kinds of evidence that you could draw on. And as I suggest at the bottom, hopefully not too hidden by Zoom paraphernalia, I'd always recommend keeping a kind of archive or scrapbook of evidence as you go through a project. Better still, you might even want to keep your scrapbook online in a blog, for example. So you're sharing your news and your achievements in an outward facing way, obviously if that's appropriate, as you go. But always, if you're working within higher education, certainly be prepared for that inevitable moment when someone asks you for that evidence. So how might you go about gathering evidence for your impact? There are loads of different ways. Some require funding and institutional capacity. Others you can definitely achieve as an ECR or as an independent or precarious scholar. So make use of partners. For example, if you're doing co-production with a museum, they'll have their own targets for impact and their own mechanisms for capturing evidence. So let them know early on what you might also want to collect. Use proxy resources. I'll come back with an illustration of that in a moment. Don't reinvent the wheel. If others have developed great evaluation tools, for example, you could take a look at the Being Human website, or if others have collected the data you need, don't do it again. Try to think imaginatively about the different kinds of impact your project could have and the variety of evidence you could use to support that. And again, find a champion partner. I said that right back at the start. Now we're going back to REF 2014 now, because there's been a lot of analytical work done around the outcomes of that. But the top scoring impact case studies there tended to have a key partnership which helped with engagement and impact. So I want to illustrate with a really brief example from my own experience. This is going back a bit further in my career now to a project in Chester. There were lots of elements to this. It was a really rewarding project, but I want to focus on a collaboration with the artist Nayan Kulkarni, also working with lots of local people through workshops to produce a light-based public art installation at St John's Ruins in the city. And it is still there if you're ever in Chester and want to go and see. So I'm using this as an example of impact and evidence because it did form an impact case study back in 2014, but that we know was graded 4-star, which is the highest grading. So here is a paragraph from the impact case study on the St John's artwork. So this is, to be clear, articulating impact within the very specific terms of the ref. And I've highlighted in purple some of the different kinds of impact mentioned. Some of it you'll see is measured in numbers. Grants or income might also include numbers of people involved. Some of it is about what changed in terms of cultural engagement, participation and understanding. Some of it is about material change to the urban environment. Some of it is about longer term capacity building, for example, in Chester's development of its UK City of Culture bid. And here, another dense slide, you don't need to take all of this in, it's just a snapshot of the different kinds of evidence used in the impact case study, because I think it can be really helpful to think about what different kind of things can I hoover up to show the value of what we're doing. So different kinds of evidence here. There's solicited feedback. We had a text message feedback service actually for this in particular. Media coverage, evidence of further grants and income. C3 on this list is use of the project in a local authority strategy. So that's a contribution to policy. And C8 here is what I meant by making use of proxy resources. So Cheshire West and Chester Unitary Authority had commissioned a report from independent consultants on the value of the city's medieval walls and medieval heritage, I don't always agree with this, but kind of, putting figures on what that brought to the city in terms of economic benefit. Now, obviously, we could never have afforded to commission a report like that ourselves, but we were able to use elements of that commissioned report that already existed and extrapolate from that. So different kinds of evidence. I want to draw this together by emphasising again that this is just one way of articulating the impact of your project. And I was asked to reflect a little bit on this specific HE-focused, REF-focused impact agenda in my words. But the REF measures what it measures. And that model of impact will never tell the whole story of your public history project. There are also problems with it still being predicated on you create an output, you do the engagement, and you have an impact. It's a little bit clunky still. We could talk all day, I think, about the inadequacy of metrics for the kinds of transformation achieved through public history and co-production. And there is, as many of you will know, lots of really interesting research going on in exactly that field. So the REF and impact is just one way of articulating what your project did. There'll be so many other dimensions to it as well. Right, gosh, bit of an information dump. Stop share. There we are.
There we are. Thanks very much, Catherine. Amy and Sarah, any comments before we go on to Amy's final talk?
Yeah, thank you so much for that. It's really comprehensive, and I think with REF there can be a bit of a danger of the tail wagging the dog, where you think of, right, what do I need to achieve for REF, and then you retrofit your public project to kind of achieve those aims. Without really taking into account what your community needs and might want out of something. But I guess it's our privilege, especially as academics, and myself as an academic support worker, is for us to be literate of REF. The public we work with don't need to know about it. And in fact, I think it would be better if they didn't. And so one of our core principles for civic engagement at Cardiff University Libraries and Archives, we put it front and centre to say we're not going to follow this philanthropic model of top-down bestowing of knowledge. And the core thing that we want to measure for ourselves is enjoyment, and have the participants actually enjoy themselves. And that is enough. Anything else beyond that, is gravy, as they say. But it can be, impact is such a punch in the face is impact. You can measure a lot of things using it, but that, I think, is the thing for us. It's for us to remember that it's our privilege to do that KPI work, to release the funding, to get out into the community. They're not interested in it. Find ways to unref the actual thing you're doing, but use your nous, use your understanding of that framework to make sure that you're getting you're hitting the marks that you need to hit for to conform with your funder.
Can I come back on that really quickly, Sarah? That yeah, absolutely, I would never use. I think it would be patronising to ever kind of use or make visible that kind of language of impact with communities that we're working with. And I totally agree with you. What you're saying about don't do things because you think they will tick certain impact boxes. And that would be key advice, I think, for anyone. You do things because there's a need in the communities you're working with, because you have a kind of you're excited as a researcher to do it. And then you think about how it can align. And what you're saying, Sarah, you've used slightly more sophisticated language talking about being literate in the ref. What I would just say is it's useful to know how to play the game, because then you get the money to do the important things that you want to be doing.
Yeah, I think it's kind of similar to what I was saying when we were talking earlier about kind of like changing the language that you use when you talk to different people. Like you said, you know, when I speak to community groups here, I don't say, oh, I'm Amy and I work for New Unity and I run a heritage project at the Meeting House. They just think, oh, she's a nice, friendly Northern lady who works in that weird church building. And they don't need to know anything more than that, you know, and then you can build a relationship from there. And I think sometimes when you're delivering a project, you can be a bit in the middle because you're using one language for like a funder, maybe using another language for the groups that you're working with in the communities, another language for maybe your volunteers and other people that you're working with, and then another language again for like the people that you're getting to sign off decisions for. So it is a really difficult job, I think, to kind of juggle all of that.
Yeah, I think acknowledging that code switching is a really, really important skill in delivering these projects in a way that, yeah, that, you know, pleases all sorts of different people, but it's a fantastic skill. So it is something you can cultivate as well.
Yes, beautifully put.
It's fascinating, yeah, really interesting. Amy, you're going to lead our last section, so over to you.
Okie doke, so I'm going to do this bit of a section which seems to be some interest in already about how do you kind of end a project and how do you ensure a legacy. And I wanted to talk about this because it's a big part of what I'm working on at the Newton Green Meeting House now. So this is a National Lottery Fund project, and we are 2 out of 4 years, so we're halfway, which I think shows you how much you need to be thinking about this proactively throughout the project. And as I said before, I'm not usually involved in the initial development of a project. I'm just here to deliver it. So we've delivered half of the project, and we've, you know, there's things that we haven't been able to deliver in the time frame because of the pandemic and, you know, things just not working out. There's things that we've changed. And also there's things that we've done very differently. And so now we're at this kind of review, and legacy and things like that are, you know, basically about 75% of what I'm working on, I would say, at the minute. So we're halfway through the project, and I am now just finishing off a strategy that will take us over the next 2 years and the 2 years post-funding. And I think that's really important to get everyone on board now while it's still exciting and interesting and everyone's still engaged, to get them to kind of, you know, buy into, right, what is this project delivering now? What's it going to deliver in the future? And who's going to do what? That doesn't mean you have to, you know, nail people down and say, right, you said that you were going to head up the website, and so in 3 years' time, I'm going to be tapping you up to do that. But I think at this point, while there's still so much enthusiasm and exciting things going on, and you've got the staff and the time and the resource and the budget to use that excitement to kind of mobilize people starting to think about the future now, rather than, you know, oh gosh, we've got 6 months left, that kind of thing. So these are the kind of things in my strategy, as you can see. So it involves kind of really focusing on our audiences. Who do we want to work with now, and who do we want to work with in the future? What's possible? Sustainability, and obviously that includes finances and things like that. And really thinking about you know, how do we serve our local community now and our audiences, and what are we able to do in the future? And just coming up with a plan. So resource is obviously an important one. I think the biggest issue really is that when you have a kind of project, you've got the money and you've got fantastic staff, and they've got time and skills, and then your funding runs out and you're really, really low on staff resource, and that can affect volunteers. Even if you're a very volunteer-led project, it's always good to have a staff member, unless you're completely, DIY, to have a staff member that can support volunteers, especially if your volunteers have needs. We're based in Hackney. A lot of our volunteers have needs, and they volunteer for a variety of reasons, and some of those are social and things as well. So it's really important to have someone who can support that. And the worst thing is that this all disappears and crumbles. You've done all this amazing work for 4 years and it disappears. Also, it's part of a lot of funding agreements that you deliver a certain part of this post-project anyway. So it's also that, we, with our funders, have said that we are going to deliver 60% of what we deliver now post-funding. So it's also part of my job to make that happen. So I think that stakeholders and partners are a really big part of this, and make sure that you've got regular contact and that they are updated and they're actively involved in these decisions. And I've worked with congregants, volunteers, community members, partners, trustees, and everyone to basically get a strategy in place that we're all happy with and that we're all kind of committed to delivering and seeing through. And I think that puts us at this stage in quite a good state. And what that has meant is that we've reviewed a lot of this programme. So we're constantly reviewing and reflecting. We have an amazing staff team. I'm the only full-time member of staff. Everyone else is part-time. Most people work remotely, so they just come in to deliver events and things like that. But everyone is really, receptive. They really like this kind of history and the social justice message that we have here, so they care. So they're very good at kind of feeding in, reflective, and we have meetings every 2 weeks about this kind of thing. So I think that reflective process has been really important in terms of the strategy. And pretty much every project I've ever worked on, you kind of at this point rip up the original plan and start again based on what's worked and what's not worked. And I think that I didn't know that when I first started doing these jobs, and I was scared. I didn't think that was what you could do. And what I would say is it's totally what you should do, and it's also expected. So don't be scared to think, oh no, but I've got to deliver this huge exhibition with this local museum. No, you don't. If that's not going to work for you, if that's not going to work for them, if there's not a need for it, use the money somewhere else. That's public money if it's heritage money, and it needs to be used properly. And I think that what we're working on now is this bottom section here. So it's really kind of balancing. We have the money and we have staff and we have resource now. So shall we spend that doing the big exciting stuff that we know that if this is a volunteer-led project in the future with less staff resource, it's not going to be possible. Maybe perhaps our volunteers don't have the skills to work with artists on an exhibition at this point, unless we train them up, unless we all decide that's something that we want in the future. But it was never the plan, and it doesn't seem like there's an appetite for that. So maybe we're best doing that now, and in the future it can focus on other parts of delivery. That's one way of doing it, or perhaps another way of doing it is doing all the, getting things in place now so it will run for the future. So slimming down your delivery and thinking, right, let's just really focus on tours, being open and having one event a month, and then that's sustainable. I'm trying to do both, so we'll see how that goes. But I think maybe a little bit of both might be the way to go. And then roles, I mentioned this earlier, but I think being really clear on what everyone's, so getting people bought into it and that are excited about it at this kind of early stage, and being accountable. So, in projects before, I've kind of set up champion sounds rubbish, but I couldn't think of another word for it here. Like someone who's accountable for part of the project. So I can break the project up into exhibitions, education, being open in the week events. And then is there someone who would like to kind of oversee that and help steer the project on that now with me, so that in 2 years' time that it can be handed over to them? And that's what I'm kind of working on at the minute. So basically flipping a very staff-led project into a very volunteer-led project so it's sustainable in the future. Which is really hard to do, and a lot of projects try and do that and has success in some ways, but So I'm really trying to work on that now. And there's elements that I've delivered successfully before, but it is really difficult. So that's one thing that I am working on. And lastly, I suppose funding and sustainability and things, is a really important part. So in terms of that, we are, really ramping up this kind of activity. So selling merchandise, creating partnerships, working on bids now for future money with other partners and things like that. Working with partners who are applying for funding and then working out if we can, be part of those grant applications and stuff like that with our resources and things. Expanding fundraising work and all these kind of things. So even though we're in a really good position at this moment in time where we still have 2 years full funding, we're already starting building on this kind of stuff now, so that we can kind of track, experiment, show sustainability, look at that kind of thing, review. The worst thing for me would be to leave this project in, a state in 2 years' time where none of these things work. So that's what I'm working on at the minute. I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you ever so much, Amy. I love that comment about halfway through, you'll just rip up the plan that you originally proposed and do what's now sensible in the light of everything that's happened. I think that's just a brilliant piece of advice for any project, and probably for many of us in any other spheres of our life as well. Let's, Sarah and Catherine, let's have you comment first of all on what you've just heard. And a reminder to everybody that the panel will be taking questions. There's a number of unanswered questions, but if you've got any questions, and now is your moment to pop them in the Q&A, and I will feed as many as I can to everybody at the end.
I wanted to just respond and say, I don't know if anyone else in the room was thinking this, but I was listening, Amy, and just thinking it just sounds incredibly impressive and professional, and all that kind of management strategy in place. And I've learned a lot from what you were saying. But I suppose I would also respond and say that, to be honest, it's quite different for me just as an academic in a university department in terms of kind of scale and scope and what can be achieved. And I noticed there's a question or comment in the chat already, maybe about workload things. And I think for me, the biggest challenge with projects has always been what happens when the funding ends, and it's the time ends as well then, and trying to keep things going when it is probably just you around all the rest of your job trying to keep things live. And I've also learned, Amy, we were talking about kind of learnings that over past projects, that it's usually just as a project finishes and the funding is cut, that it's reached its biggest reach and engagement and participation, and then suddenly there's that cliff edge. So all I would say, it's a much less sophisticated model than the one you've taken us through, Amy, but at my own small scale cottage industry kind of level, it's about kind of finding ways to keep things ticking over, keep things warm. Might be as simple as keeping your Twitter account going, you may be still going and sort of speaking at events, that kind of thing, managing expectations so people know there's going to be a lower level of engagement from you for a while, but being ready so that when you get those approaches or when an opportunity arises, it's still being kept warm and you can jump back in. But I think the model you outlined is incredibly impressive and something that I find really inspirational. That I suppose the way I kind of keep that legacy going is often a lot less ambitious and smaller scale, but it still has its value as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Amy. I think on just a personal note, as I've just stepped away from an active role in the Women's Museum after being so involved for over 6 years, it's a really, reflection and a bit of critical inquiry is absolutely fundamental to the work of a public historian. Just because it's so easy to jump onto the next project and so easy to, oh gosh, we need to get started with this. Carve out that time for yourself, not only because it will benefit the next project that you take on, but also it gives you pause to think of your own learning outcomes for yourself. Did you find the budget really difficult to manage with this one, or did you find speaking in front of people was there not enough time to get the printed outputs done? There are always going to be lessons learned, so it's really important to cost in that reflective phase if you can and carve out that time. But I just wanted to, I guess, speak a tiny word on that kind of legacy. Two examples that I can think of. There was one at Museum Wales where one of our librarians had written a blog about an exhibition that had taken place in 1969. And it was just, it had the search engine optimization, the metadata, everything. It was very findable because the title of the blog was really clear. It wasn't, please stop putting puns in your project titles, guys. No one is Googling puns. Stop it. Say the words that are the thing in your blog titles and your project titles, please. I know the funders love a pun, or you know, imagining the something, investigating the something, do something, do something. Be very clear, as Amy was saying, in the language that you use. But anyway, this is how this man had found, after 42 years, a blog about the exhibition where he was an invigilator. And he was so impressed by it that he decided to make his home in Wales. He was from Yorkshire originally, studying some sort of art and design, and had then gone on to stay in Wales, start a family here, and had become a professor of his chosen métier. So he had not only stayed here, but he had forged a career in art and in museums. But it took us 42-ish years to get that piece of extremely amazing feedback, and it was completely serendipitous that we did. But what an amazing effect to have had on someone. So there are some things you can't measure. And I'm thinking of Cardiff University. You know, we had the International Day of People with Disabilities last week. The Cardiff University Social Services was volunteer-led, run by students. They started the first group home that challenged the idea that people with learning disabilities should be institutionalized. They lived alongside people with learning disabilities who had been previously kept in hospitals. And I was looking through their archive, and that project started in 1969. By 1984, the guidance nationally was to move away from the institutionalization of people with learning disabilities and to adopt the group home model that they had developed alongside and with those people with learning disabilities. And again, it was something that took, I just did some maths, 15 plus years to achieve, but it was done on a volunteer basis. So, you know, if you really, really believe in something, there are ways to keep something going, but that's not going to be every project, but sometimes there are things where it's really worth carrying on and finding ways to do it.
Thank you. We've got a number of questions coming in on the chat, and I'm mindful of the time, and I just wonder if we might just go to one of the first questions that came in from Clarinda Karma, and she just, we've heard a lot about sustainability, but she also poses the question, how can you make your projects financially sustainable after public funding has run out? And I just wonder if there's anything more any of you would say about financing or ongoing financing for projects after a grant of some description has run out. Any thoughts there?
I think in a university-based project, there are, even in the humanities, there are rare opportunities for, you know, ongoing income streams. You know, I'm thinking of in the centre that I lead recently, we've launched a smartphone app that has a free dimension and a subscription-based dimension. That's never going to kind of pay for the work we do, but it's a bit of kind of income. I think, speaking very honestly from someone based within a university, significant income comes through looking for future tranches of funding, rather than any more kind of commercial kinds of income, just because of the nature of demands on my time and where I'm based and what I do, which means you've always got that cycle of an injection of funding and then a cliff edge that we've talked about. But I think it probably depends. There's people here based in really different contexts, and it varies, I think.
I would say it's similar for us. You know, I think we're going to develop further income streams with our events. You know, and we run a bar when we have events, and that always helps, you know, and we take donations and we're ramping that up, fundraising and merchandise. But essentially what we're going to be doing is, you know, going for an Arts Council grant soon, for example, and exploring other funding pots and things like that, because you know, it costs a lot of money to run what we do, and I think that it's valuable and people really like it, but you know, we're going to have to see how sustainable that is in the future. And I think also on that, you know, we're talking about projects and stuff. Projects are projects, and sometimes it's okay for it to end as well, I think, is one thing that we didn't really clarify, you know, and I think maybe a good project also is really clear about that from the start and says this is the end point and this is the goal. You know, for example, the Enzine publishing project was a bit of a kind of pet passion of mine, and you know, we spent money printing them out. We sent 200 copies to community libraries, community groups and things like that. And we handed them out locally, and then we ran out, and it was like, shall we spend another couple of £100 printing more? And I thought, no, that's done. We've delivered what we wanted from that, and there's other things that we can pull from that, so we can do a walk based on it, we can put it on the website. But I think in that capacity it did what we wanted it to do, and we've achieved it, and that's okay to leave things.
Thank you. We have had a number of questions about the kind of international dimension. I must say I'm completely blown away by the international nature of the audience that we've had here, and I don't think we anticipated that. And had we anticipated it, we would probably have brought somebody in on the panel from a completely other part of the world to speak to those ideas. But I think they're worth raising anyway, and we do rest assured that we have noticed this and we'll be bearing this in mind for future events. Joshua Chakawa has said one of the worst challenges in doing fieldwork in countries such as Zimbabwe includes lack of funding and proper gadgets to allow for maximum collection of data and effective interaction with the community. We largely rely on communities in gathering data. How can such challenges be unlocked? And I'll just link that with Matthias Wong as well, who says, how might we balance the interests of different community partners, particularly, and I think, I mean, it's a problem anywhere in the world, but he says, particularly if there exists an imbalance in power or authority, such as, for example, between a museum and, in his example, an Indigenous group. I just wonder if any of you would like to speak to that.
I could start with a couple of comments. I've got a slightly different kind of comment for each of the questions. First of all, I'm really grateful to Joshua from the question, because I think that's really helpful in terms of opening my own horizons to think about the broader context in which this kind of work happens. One thing I think is that one of the things that's come up quite a lot in the kind of projects we've talked about has been the digital and collecting data. And of course, participation in co-production can take many, many different forms. So I don't have a full understanding, Joshua, of the complexity of the challenges that you're describing there. But, you know, one thing I would share from my experience is that perhaps our most effective engagement and participation tool for the St Thomas Way was the measuring and sending people out, finding bits of string and, you know, engaging that together. It doesn't have to involve a website. A project doesn't always have to involve data. And I think what, you know, in that kind of big data, lots of collection sort of sense. And I think thinking about what's possible, what's scalable, what's achievable within different contexts and with different communities is really important. And then Matthias's question, I think is really interesting, and we've had to deal with that not in the context that you're thinking of, Matthias, but in the Towns and the Cultural Economies of Recovery project that I'm involved with at the moment, that Emma mentioned. We've been working with towns across across England who've received funding through the government as part of Levelling Up and Towns Fund grants, and we've been bringing together in workshops some of the senior policymakers in town, so the people who are deciding how their multi-million pound investments are spent, and then participants from the community and freelance creatives whose livelihoods are kind of impacted by this. And I think one of the things that's really important when dealing with those imbalances or asymmetries of power or hierarchies is taking people into a different space to engage with each other. So in this case, actually, because of COVID, that space was an online space, but it was a different environment. And in this case, again, we worked with creative practitioners who got people engaging in quite different sort of activities. So it brought in totally different registers and idioms and different kinds of output. And it meant that conversations weren't taking place within the usual structures that they happen. And that was really helpful.
Yeah, I think in kind of similar to Catherine, we've worked So exhibitions were never really kind of the plan in this building, but it's kind of come out that artists are interested, and then we had conversations, and artists had kind of proposed doing exhibitions here, and we thought, great, okay, why not? That was a steep learning curve because I'd never worked with artists before. It's a completely different way. Like a historian has a different way of looking at and examining things to a sociologist. It was just a framework I didn't know. And obviously you're going to make mistakes, and it's messy, and also sometimes that can be heated and horrible, and it can get personal, and but it also is really, really valid to learn those things. And I think that if you invite someone into your space with a different framework, you can't then just go, no, we don't do that. Or now, you've got to expect that what they're going to say and how they want to use your resources is going to be different, and you might have to try it out, or let them lead it and see how that goes. And I find that difficult also because there are barriers that you have. Obviously there are barriers. Once you know what your barriers are, then you can be really clear about that, and then that's where you want to be, where you can say, look, we would love to work with whoever, this is what we can offer, we can do this, but we can't do this because of whatever. But it takes time for you to work out what those kind of like parameters are. So my kind of main learning that I've learned really this year, so very recently, is just that if you're going to invite people in to work with you, you've got to be open to that they're going to use things and want things in a different way. And if you're serious about that, then you have to let them lead on that.
With just to add for Joshua's query, I know that there are a lot at the moment of kind of mostly European, some American museums who are and institutions as well, who are using decolonization as a buzzword, but in terms of actually resourcing actual heritage work and heritage infrastructure in countries formerly colonized, that they're not putting their money where their mouth is. But I would point to the work that Goodman Gwazira is doing in Namibia through the Phoenix Project at Cardiff University, and with the Welsh Government as well, where essentially it's been a resource exchange rather than, let us come and teach you the correct way to store this item or to conduct field work. It's been actually looking at how governments like the Welsh Government can be actively participating in decolonization in a way that's addressing the material needs of the heritage industry in countries that have been looted and colonized. So yeah, that's Goodman Gwazira and the Phoenix Project. With regards to stakeholder management, make it really explicit, draw it out. I find it's really useful to do stakeholder mapping where you have your core. These are the people who have decision-making power. These are the people who are actively involved day to day, actively involved every week. And you can almost make a concentric circle. These are the people who we need to keep informed, but have no decision-making power. And normally that's where your kind of local authorities and funders kind of come in, is where actually you want to keep them informed in a way that doesn't then make them feel like they have some sort of influence. It's more of a need to know, here's another good news story, things are going great. And then you've got people who perhaps actively you don't want involved. For whatever reason, community projects can be really, really complicated. And that sometimes it's actually necessary to articulate that and be like, okay, well, this didn't work, or this group doesn't get on with this one historically. This project isn't going to address that. So that's another way, is to literally map your stakeholders, but don't show the map to your stakeholders. Shred it once you've used it.
Brilliant, thank you. We're literally, we're really against the clock now. I'm just going to throw out one quick final question. I apologise to everybody whose questions we couldn't get round to. But there's a question that's come in at the end from David Walter, and he just asks, do you think that public history is a political act or a social philosophy and a practice? And I just wonder if you'd like to have a little comment on public history as a political act.
I mean, there's rarely anything I do that isn't a political act, apparently. So I'd go for that classic, the personal is political. I think COVID has shown us that. We've had an intersection of academic space, civic space. My master's, which I'm graduating tomorrow, I'm really excited, looked at how people participated in the civic realm whilst under legal physical restriction. So how did you engage with the civic space while you were stuck in your house? So, you know, it proved to us that, yeah, we can protest on our doorsteps, we can build community in our gardens and on our streets. Thank you, Tony. And it's, you know, I think it's part of that rich tapestry, to be honest. I don't think it's necessarily exceptionally political. It can be if you want it to be, but it's one lever, I think, of a way to be a good citizen.
Thanks. Amy or Catherine?
Well, I'll just say that one of the reasons I was so excited to be on this panel is because I admire the work that Sarah and Amy do in terms of activism and kind of social justice so much. And, you know, I find their work really inspiring. So for me, absolutely about you know, activism. I was thinking a couple of weeks ago we were running some creative workshops using the history of places to imagine possible futures for places. So history is a resource for hope, but activist hope, you know, hope with teeth. You know, I think that's really important.
Thanks. Fine. Amy, you don't want to unmute at this point.
I guess, yeah, I mean, for me, it's a passion to do that. So, and it's a privilege to be able to work in a kind of sphere where I can do that. And I think, you know, public history is an amazing tool to be able to do that. And, you know, much like Sarah said, like, you can bring these people together that maybe wouldn't be in these kind of spaces and things like that. So I think it's kind of like inherently political. And I think that I love doing it, and I like all the different ways that you can do public history and the different ways that you can draw someone in sneakily without telling them that it's history, because I never do that. And so I'll just sneakily tell them it's something else, and then before they know it, they've come in and actually there's a link to Mary Wollstonecraft, and you know, that's quite nice. I quite like doing that thing. So yeah, I would say so, David. Yeah.
Brilliant, Amy. Thank you ever so much indeed. Well, time is really up, so it's time to bring our event to a close. And just before giving my thanks to the panel, I've just got a few items of RHS news I'd like to share. The first, of course, is to remind everybody that this is a part of a series of training events, and we've got 3 lined up for 2022. Our dates are the 8th of March, the 14th of July, the 6th of December. And the first 2 are about finding employment as a historian. The first one about trying to find an academic career, the second about trying to find work outside the university. And our final event in December is provisionally about broadcasting and working with the media. I'd also like to remind you that this event has been recorded, and anybody who's in the room today will receive an email within the next fortnight or so, providing the link and more detail about how to find that recording. And we held an event in July this year about getting your first article published, and that's been recorded and that's available on the RHS website. I'd also just like to say a moment to say that the international nature of today's audience has been absolutely incredible, very unanticipated, and it's been a real pleasure to be part of a virtual room with so many people from so many parts of the world. I'd like to just take a moment to remind everybody that membership of the Royal Historical Society is open to everybody. We've got a range of different categories for everybody, from starting a first postgraduate degree to finishing a PhD, publishing books, or of course for participating in historical work entirely outside the university sector. And of course, it goes without saying, we accept members from anywhere in the world. So if you're not a member, take a look at our membership pages, which will be popping into the chat, and consider whether you'd like to join. Our next deadline is the 10th of January. Finally, a very, very big thank you to all of our speakers. This really has been a fascinating and very engaging conversation. Thank you for giving up your time. Thank you everybody for joining us and for your engagement through the questions. And we hope to see you all again soon.